Hey everyone, this is Miss Saunders here, and I'm going to deliver the lecture on the week 7 content. This week we had readings from two of our different books. So I just want to start out by letting you know I will first be reading from Writing for Business, that chapter, and then later on I'll segue into discussing the chapters from Better Business Writing. Okay, so an important idea that is also discussed in chapter 1 of Writing for Business, but is kind of gone into a little bit more detail here, is this idea of the thinking phase, which contributes as much to the style as the actual process of writing. So relationships between words, sentences, and paragraphs can be clarified and intensified by thinking through precisely what it is you want to say. I really can't stress this point enough. Just to use as a point of reference, I'm presently at work on a novel, and my joke is that for every single typed page that I have 10 pages of handwritten and kind of sloppy notes. I guess this is my second time working through a manuscript, so I know that I need to have a really good idea of what I'm trying to say before I put any words on the page. And by thinking through that process of thinking what I'm trying to say, why it's important, I really have a better idea of how to say it. Because once you have a really good idea of what the content is, then you can be the best at expressing it formally, that is, through language. So oftentimes people just think through as they write a draft, which is fine, but if you're going to do that, then you'll just have to write 3 or 4, right? Because as you think through the idea more and more, the easier it is to write it successfully. So this week we looked at 7 symptoms of unworkable language. So, and these are all things that I see pretty often as a teacher of writing. So indulging in figurative laxity, universalizing, making incompatible connections, violating parallelism in structure and content, escaping into pleasantries, repeating disadvantageously, and pyramiding modifiers. So indulging in the figurative laxity, which is at the top of our list, you want to avoid using overused figurative expressions, like for examples of figures of speech, so saying like get off the ground, nip in the bud. Just these are kind of phrasings that you hear often, and you might find yourself subconsciously lapsing into these figures of speech, and I think it's natural because they're phrases that we hear all the time. And I think especially early on in our writing careers, it is natural to want to kind of you kind of mimic things that you hear and that you read. You kind of subconsciously just reiterate them in your own writing. So, but here I am telling you to try to avoid doing it if all possible. Try to avoid doing it if all possible. There's also this idea of mixed metaphors, which is no one tool can sufficiently appraise every factor of company performance. So here I think they're mixing up tools in the shed, kind of going through that metaphor. But as a reader, I read this and I'm like, it just takes me out. I'm like, what is happening? The meaning is not clear. It's not easy to parse. It's confusing. And I guess there is a deeper meaning to it. Okay, I think about a little bit more tools in the shed. No one tool for every shed, or no one tool for everything that you want to do. But at the same time, that's kind of the type of technique that you'd want to use maybe if you were writing poetry, where you want your readers to like think deeply about your doing. But for business writing, you really want your message to be clear and to the point. So another common problem is this idea of universalizing. So, and it's risky to do this from the point of accuracy and from the point of reliability. So an example, this new drug is in its infancy, and like all anti-cancer available drugs, it is capable of producing serious side effects. Here, the writer includes every anti-cancer drug ever produced. It's an inaccurate way to write because it's not, all anti-cancer drugs don't actually produce serious side effects. That is kind of just a wrong information that's supplied by the writer of this. And basically it has an opposite, it will have the opposite of its intended impact on your reader. And I think where universalizing comes is like when we're writing, especially in professional settings where we want to sound impressive, it's kind of a natural, there's a natural inclination to go for perhaps a certain flair or kind of a certain grandiosity in the language because you're ultimately writing to impress and to make money. But if you universalize in a way that's inaccurate, you will come off as unreliable and you will come off as the opposite of impressive. You will come off as unimpressive. So that's just something to keep in mind. Keep in mind also that it's an understandable mistake, and if you've made it before, that's okay. It's just something to keep in mind moving forward. So making incompatible connections. I think this also is kind of a symptom of wanting to sound kind of impressive or wanting to present information in a certain way or trying to reach a certain conclusion and you do so too hastily. So it is the logical interrelating of ideas between sentences. So the illogical interrelating of ideas between sentences. So basically, if A plus B equals C, but perhaps C doesn't come from A plus B. It's a non sequitur, which means it's two ideas that are unrelated placed next to each other. Here the example of, because of the difficulty establishing a person's capacity, is it impossible to grade everyone on an individual basis? Again, and this is kind of a maybe linking quality of this kind of unworkable language qualities that we've seen, these examples, I have to stop and the connection between these two sentences, these two statements, because of the difficulty establishing a person's capacity, and then it is impossible to grade everyone on an individual basis. I have to pause and think about how are these two things related? Does the second thing proceed naturally from the first? And you kind of have to like think about it for a second, and then you realize no, it doesn't. So it's an incompatible connection between these two things. And I see this quite often when I read essays, like rhetorical essays, rhetorical analysis, or literary essays, where a student naturally is trying to come to a certain conclusion because they know they need to make that conclusion, but hasn't spent the time kind of building naturally to a point. So it's just something to be aware of if you find yourself trying to present information in a certain way, making sure that you're making sure the connections between your points is logical. Another one is violating parallelism in structure and content. So that's this idea of saying different things in a similar way that is confusing for the reader. So some of you may have learned about grammar parallelism at some points in your life, but if you haven't, grammar parallelism is where you say, you structure sentences in a similar way and you put them side by side to one another, or you structure content in a similar way and you put it side by side. So you can see that grammar parallel in terms of the structure, the syntax of the sentence. So when you don't want to do parallelism is when you're talking about different things, and so you don't want to structure different things in a similar way, because if things are structured in a similar way, a reader is naturally or subconsciously going to want to look for that relationship between content and form. And if it seems like there's no rhyme or reason to it, it obfuscates or confuses meaning. So example 1, a financial product and legal analysis will be made. Okay, again, I have to stop for a second. Financial product and legal analysis are 3 very different types of analysis. And when they're placed together like that in a list, it becomes confusing because there's not a like solid or obvious connection between these 3 things. Another example is metal, wood, and transportation are necessary to industry. Metal, wood, at least metal and wood are both like tangible physical things, but transportation is more of an abstract word which could point to a number of different physical things, and the fact that they're all lumped together like that is confusing for the readers, and that's an example of parallelism not being advantageous because they shouldn't be structured in such similar ways, even because they're different. So escaping into pleasantries. So while in business writing, it is important to write towards the positive and away from the negative, but writers need to consider readers' awareness of the fakeness of excessive pleasantries. It can come off as ingenuine and therefore offensive. So it's just something to keep in mind in terms of like using the right emotional tone. Um, so some kind of tips for how to kind of toe that fine line between expressing the relevant amount of courtesy and not escaping into excessive pleasantries. So, and I think this is especially true when you're dealing with bad news. Um, you want the flat-footed statement, even if it requires use of a negative article. You want a genuine, natural approach when you're talking about, negative things, or perhaps when you're using courtesy. So especially when you're talking about bad news, the writer should always keep in mind two things, which is one, the ultimate objective, which is seldom negative in itself, and two, the control of emphasis. So when using courtesy, just try to be controlled to the extent to which you use it and not kind of go over the top to the extent that it feels ingenuine. Okay, so repeating disadvantageously. So repetition is necessary, but you can use new words and find new ways to repeat the same content. There can be times when repeating a word is useful to draw emphasis. You ultimately always want to repeat ideas, and you need to do so for your reader to understand, but you don't want to do it unintentionally, therefore boring your readers. So the bottom line is use repetition if you need to, and of course sometimes you will, but try to avoid doing it by accident. Try to put a focus on using new words, new verbs to express new contents. I guess I always place an explicit sort of emphasis or tension on verbs because I think they're usually like the most important part of your sentence because that's where the action is coming from. But in general, you want to avoid doing it by accident because you don't have anything else to say. And if you feel like you're kind of lacking on new vocabulary, reading is a really good way to continue to kind of intake and process language in different ways in which it's used. The New Yorker is a good place to start. Yeah, that would probably be my recommendation if you find yourself like wanting to learn some new vocabulary. Someone suggested that I read the New Yorker when I was studying for the GRE, which is the test you take for graduate school, for the vocabulary section. Anyways, so next symptom of unworkable language is pyramiding modifiers. So, and you can see this kind of this thing happening in language because you might feel tempted to pyramid modifiers if you're trying to write concisely. So a modifier is a word, especially an adjective or noun, used attributively that restricts or adds to the sense of the head noun. So if you're trying to write concisely, so you're trying to say as much as possible in as little space as possible, you might find yourself pyramiding modifiers. And I sometimes moonlight as a technical writer for a disaster relief consultancy, and I see this pretty often. I see sentences that are just so heavy with modifiers, and it just is very difficult to read. So here we have an example. The index budget profit shown in the budget at the index volume column should be adjusted by the variable profit applicable to the total sales volume variance from the index budget using the total divisional index budget to get variable profit rate. Okay, so you can see here how a lot of the modifiers here are put in italics, which can show the great extent to which this sentence is just stacked with modifiers. And as you can see, the sentence is hard to read. It's hard to pick out what's going on. So an example of how to use how to structure your sentence more advantageously. So we have the phrase, the index budget profit versus the profit and the index budget. And this is my little joke for the PowerPoint of who said it better, kind of like who wore it better. I think the second option is better. You see that the first phrase, the index budget profit, has those modifiers kind of stacked together to modify profit, whereas the second phrase uses the preposition of in and the article the to kind of express the relationship between the two things. Or yeah, so that would be my suggestion for ways in which you can try to kind of avoid pyramiding your modifiers and sentences. Another thing to kind of note about this quality is that it often starts out as language used internally within a company, and I think then it just accidentally spreads outwards in terms of like communication with people outside of the company. So if you find yourself communicating like that with people with whom you work, that's fine, but just keep in mind that when you want to really try to avoid using it when you're communicating with people outside as much as possible. And even if you are communicating with people in your company, if you're writing, you can always find a better way to structure your sentences than kind of pyramiding the modifiers like that in ways that makes the sentence nearly unintelligible. So on clarity, we're going to see now to the content in better business writing. So, and this kind of reiterates other content that we've covered this semester. So if you're trying to write clearly, you want to think of concrete words, simple sentences, easy transitions between unified paragraphs. You want to think about eliminating wordiness and grammatical weakness, which steal fun essentially from your readers because they have to work to get through it instead of it being obvious and clear to them. So here we are transitioning to content and better business writing. So you're going to want to, when you're thinking about writing memos and reports, I'll go back there for a second. You want to pick a short, clear title, one that will concisely inform what the reader what the text is about. Want to summarize key specifics up front. So you want to figure out the main issues. 3 is a good platform number to strive for. And for each main issue, state the issue in a way that anyone can understand. So again, you want to avoid using that jargon or pyramiding modifiers as might be the common way to speak within members of the company. You want to think about, communicating with people outside your niche. You want to think about your solution, and you want to think about the reason for your solution. So in general, you want to practice writing for 3 readers. You want to be an executive looking for a quick summary. You want to write for a line of readers with or without your knowledge. And you want to think about future readers who 2 years from now will be looking to grab information from your document. And just a note on organization, I think if you organize your paragraphs into smaller paragraphs and think about putting one main idea in each one with clear topic sentences, it'll be very easy for future readers years from now to be grab information from it. So that's something to keep in mind. In terms of research, you want to discern relevant sources of information. You want to synthesize relevant sources and observations and filter out the rest. And you want to cite your sources for this report in Chicago-style format. So I did quite a bit of thinking about what formatting style I wanted y'all to use. Typically in English classes or humanities classes, you use MLA style formatting. I did a bit of research in preparation for this class, and it seemed to me like Chicago would be the style that some of you might use in different professional settings. However, if you want to use a different formatting style, that's fine. Just let me know, send me an email, and I'll okay it. I really want you guys to practice what you think will be most useful for you in your fields. So the reason I chose Chicago is because that seems like the most common professional way to format, but it could also depending on what you're interested in doing professionally. Okay, so steps in terms of writing your memo. You want to limit the scope of your assignment. You want to research to the point where you understand the problem of whatever you're researching. And you want to state the problem so clearly that anyone could understand why it's worth solving. So in terms of putting research in your own words, so instead of copy and pasting, I would essentially like you, for the most part, to put the research in your own words and cite your source instead of kind of using block quotes in the text. I think this is just a good practice to do. It not only shows that you're able to process the information, but it keeps like the style of the writing consistent because it's all in your own voice. And I think it's a good professional skill to learn how to like take research and put it in your own words. So I thought I'd give you guys an example of what exactly I mean by this. So you want to use an example of a direct quote from the text. So 50% of Americans love candy, especially in suburban areas with high average incomes. So this is fake. I made this up. So I said that the source article is Americans and Candy, and the source is from the New York Times. So an example of how I would suggest to format information like this, where you'd want to put it in your, summarize the content in your own words. So half of suburban Americans intensely enjoy eating candy. You see, I've used the Chicago style kind of footnote, so kind of the source information would accompany the footnote at the bottom of the text. So that's an example of what I'm kind of looking for you to do in your memo or report. So that's the basics of the information for today. Just kind of going back to who you're going to write this assignment for. I think just keep in mind that writing for 3 readers is kind of an interesting challenge in terms of intended audience. You'll want to use simple language and include enough of the context for the uneducated reader to understand, but not so much that the educated reader becomes bored. So that'll kind of pose an interesting challenge for you guys this week. All right, I think I hope this has been helpful, and please let me know if you have any questions, and good luck with your final project.